Joe Patrych. I'm here with Stephen Masi, and we're going to talk today about Brahms. Specifically, Stephen's new CD called Brahmsiana, which combines two of the late opuses of Brahms with pieces by John Seiner and Robert Chumley. Welcome, Steve. And we're going to start by talking about the concept of the album, because Brahms albums are not a rarity, but this album is unusual in that the composers involved in this record took at least some of their inspiration from the works of late Brahms.
Right. Well, I went to school with Robert Chumley. We went to Juilliard together, so we were old friends, and we recently became reacquainted. And he was telling me that he was a pianist at Juilliard, and now he composes. He's been composing. He's writing operas. He's a very successful composer. Anyway, he had this piece that he was wondering if I would care to look at, and I liked it very much. It's three intermezzi, which take their inspiration from Opus 117 by Brahms. Now, they're not paraphrases, they're not thematically related necessarily. There are hints of thematic allusion to 117, but they're very beautiful pieces, and so I had no intention of recording Brahms, but the idea became interesting to me, that we would juxtapose his piece with the 117. And then, of course, we needed more time on the record, so we expanded it to 118 and I commissioned a piece by a young man, Jonathan Seiner, who is, as you know, we together recorded his piano sonata.
Right. He started out as a pianist, but he's certainly moved very big into composition now.
Yeah, and he's having a rapid rise in the music world. And I commissioned him to write a piece that was reminiscent of 118, or took its inspiration from Opus 118 and recorded 118. And this is the idea of the record. It's the recording. It's music by and inspired by Brahms.
Right. Let's talk about that a little bit. What does that mean to be inspired by Brahms? Those late pieces, and I personally consider 117 and 118 to be emotionally very different from one another. Now, Bob Chumley's piece is taken, as you said, from 117, and it is three intermezzi, as are the three pieces, Opus 117. But when you say inspiration, there are not actually, as you say, there are not a lot of thematic connections, there's not a lot of structural connections. Where's the influence?
118 are, 117 are pieces that are extraordinarily contemplative, you know. They are inward looking. They are pieces that are, you'd have to say, are soul searching. They're referred to by Brahms as, I think he referred to them as lullabies of his discontent, or lullabies of his sorrows. And the Chumley pieces, although the second movement is a scherzo, somehow in tone, and it's mostly in tone and structure of the piece, a first movement that is kind of sets the mood, followed by a somewhat a jaunty in places second movement, but this otherworldly last movement, which puts you right back into that world of Brahms. Now, I don't know if that answers the question, but it certainly describes Robert's piece. And the relationship is it's pretty apt. I mean, it's pretty good, you know.
Yeah, as I recall when we did the record, I felt more that his piece was in a way more organic, that the intermezzi of 117 are really separate pieces. They exist in their own encapsulated world themselves. Mm-hmm. There's no real connection between them other than the emotional connection of that period of Brahms' life. But whereas Robert's piece, I feel, is almost like a little sonata.
Yeah, it is actually more through composed, isn't it? Yeah, the Brahms pieces are quite separate. I don't necessarily think that they're meant as a set. You know, that you'd have to perform them all together, which
That's a whole other discussion.
Which you mentioned in the liner notes.
Yeah, there's a whole other discussion as to whether these collections should be even performed as collections.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in a recital you can, or you don't have to. Of course, for recording's sake, you have the freedom to listen to one separately. You don't have to listen to the whole thing consecutively. So the kind of the problem is kind of taken off your shoulders in a way.
Now, John Siner's piece is somewhat different because one thing, as I recall, it's 4 movements, and it has a very fleet and kind of energetic third movement, if I remember correctly. And
well, so does 118.
Well, 118 only has the ballade.
Yeah.
Is really its only energetic movement, and I assume that's where he got his inspiration for that.
The inspiration comes from Brahms's kind of biographical material. He takes a lot of the Frei aber einsam motif and works it into the piece. Mm-hmm. This is late music. Brahms, of course, was writing it in the late part of his life. They are his final statements for piano, that on Opus 119. But Jonathan's a young man. And what he's writing is, I think, a young man's impression of what it looks like to look back on what he's living now.
You know, brings up the subject, though, you say it's late pieces of a composer. But we can only say that in retrospect, because when the composer's writing it, he's probably not thinking these are his last works for piano.
Well, except for Brahms. I mean, Brahms is a lot older than most people. I mean, I think that's true of Schubert. Schubert wasn't thinking that these were going to be his last pieces. I'm not sure he was aware that he was dying. He wasn't writing a last statement. But Brahms at that point was really looking, I mean, he was thinking about retiring. You know, he would get brought back into his world of composing by, you know, meeting another love of his life, you know. And in this, you remember the woman's name? I don't remember the woman's name.
No.
Eulenfeld or something like that.
No, but actually a lot of his inspiration also came from that clarinetist.
Right.
Mühlberg, I think was
Mühlenfeld or something like that. He
wrote 3 pieces or 3 sets of pieces
so
for him.
I think Brahms did have the idea that he was summing up his life. It makes this music a lot different to play from any other Brahms.
Yeah, because I like to personally look at composers more objectively. When Beethoven wrote Opus 111, I don't think he was thinking that I'm done with the piano sonata. I think it's the circumstances.
Right.
I mean, after all, there's 22 opuses after the last piano sonata, including such miniatures as the Ninth Symphony and the Missa Solemnis.
Right.
So clearly he wasn't necessarily consciously thinking that Opus 111 was going to be his last piano sonata. Of course, we can't know this, but I'm looking at evidence here. In Brahms' case, there's relatively little after that group of pieces. But I also still question whether they were simply published together because it was convenient to do so. And 118 in particular strikes me as a group of pieces that have very little to do with one another.
Right, but they do. There is an arc to them. I mean, they kind of start with a fury, and end with a whimper. You know, there's a little bit of life cycle. I mean, of course, it's hindsight. 20/20 hindsight. But they do start out with this fireball of a first movement, and kind of end in this sort of tragic last piece, which sounds like the end of the world.
Except it's not the last piece, because then you had another opus after it.
No, the last piece of 118.
118, yeah, but it's not his last piano piece by any
but it's the
stretch
last one of this set, this published set.
So let's go back to Jonathan's piece as a comparative to 118. Where do you think the influences are in Jonathan's piece?
Mostly in the use of the Brahmsian kind of retrospective quality, the reflection of his life up to that point, the free but lonely motive, just a memory of youth. I mean, I think that's the name of the piece. Mm-hmm. And I believe that's what Jonathan was getting at.
It's interesting for a young composer. He was maybe 24 when he wrote that cycle, to write a piece called Memory of Youth.
Right.
From somebody who has youth.
Yes.
So clearly the inspiration must have been profound.
I can't really speak for that, but I mean, I wouldn't say it was like method acting, but it's certainly it's kind of wise beyond his years, I would have to say that. Mm.
So when putting together a concept album of this sort, which I love these ideas, because the last thing I want to see is, the Appassionata Waldstein and Moonlight on a CD. This has been done to death.
Right. In your words, it was like we were talking about another project recently, and you said that sounds like every Alfred Brendel record made in the 1970s. Of course, in the 1970s was a different story, but now we're how many years later? So.
Well, this brings up the subject of recording in the 21st century and the difficulty of coming up with original concepts when so many people have tried to come up with concepts.
I thought this was a nice opportunity to, I am interested in playing new music. I mean, we have a responsibility to do that. And my heart, of course, is with the canon, the core repertoire. But I do like playing new music. So it's a great way to have both.
On the other hand, one has to evaluate the new music carefully.
Well, I think these pieces are great, and so do you, right?
No, I do. I'm not talking about these pieces. Yeah. I'm talking about the whole idea of playing new music.
Yeah.
Cannot be just any composer throws whatever popped out of their pen at a given moment, and you're supposed to play it.
But I have favorites.
I think one of the problems in our century is the emphasis on new music has created a body of music of extremely variable quality. I mean, there is some stuff that deserves its one hearing and then should collect dust for the remainder of time. And then
that's always been true. I remember.
I guess that has, because there's plenty of composers during Beethoven's era that are never played for good reason.
I remember Vincent Persichetti, when I was in his class at Juilliard, he said, you have to understand that 99% of the music written at any particular time is garbage. And, of course, we don't have to listen to Beethoven's contemporaries.
However, he was not talking about himself.
No, I don't think so.
I'm just pointing that out because I happen to think that Persichetti was a great composer.
He was.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is that, and the sifting process is something that we don't do with the canon, because the canon already has been sifted.
Right.
So our responsibility is to sift the new stuff.
I've been playing Brahms all my life, and never really got at all involved in the late pieces. because I just couldn't make them sound good. And then I realized that what I was doing was playing them all wrong. I had the wrong sound, you know. I was playing a sound that was very appropriate for the chamber music, which I've done every Brahms chamber music piece now for piano, and you know, the piano concertos, the sonatas, that big burnished meaty sound that we associate with Brahms. It didn't work in this late music, and I had to sort of lighten the touch and be much more. This is a funny word when you think of Brahms, but lacy in the approach. Clear, transparent, to make the listener aware of the rich and wonderful counterpoint.
Exactly. I was going to say the counterpoint is so sophisticated.
So sophisticated.
That to clarify it is the difficulty of those pieces.
And the thing was, when that happened, these pieces, for me, became something that I felt were mine,
mm-hmm.
you know. Maybe not exclusively, but at least I had a way into them, you know. And that was great for me, because, you know, we're talking about the canon. What's interesting about it? Well, they're works of genius, and they
Generally,
constantly bear rethinking. So they don't get old, you know, they do not get old. It's like reading Dickens, it just does not get old, you know.
Yeah, but I think what's happened now with the ease of being able to listen and the ease of being able to record and create has created a situation, I think, where many pieces of the canon have become, shall we say, over-canonized, perhaps a little bit.
Yeah, that may be true, but, you know,
I mean, a great performance is a great performance, regardless. Right. The problem is the bell curve of mediocrity gets wider and wider.
I love the Chopin B minor sonata, but I'm not going to record it. You know, it's just, it's been done so much. You know, the ballades. You know, it's not. The world doesn't need a Stephen Masi ballades recording. You know, but these pieces, I play what I want. You know, with an eye on that. Certain music is overexposed. Now, you know, I have my tastes. There's a lot of classical music that I think should be, that I think should be put in the refrigerator for 20 years and, you know, come out 20 years later and it might sound fresh again, you know. But the really great stuff, I can hear Brahms every day. I can hear Schumann every day. I can hear Beethoven, of course, every day, you know, and
right,
Schubert.
But
you know?
On a more specific analysis, to more specifically into it, there are pieces, at least for me personally, of all three of those composers, I don't need to hear anytime soon.
Yeah, yeah. I guess maybe I'm you know, for me, I can, you know.
You can listen to any Beethoven sonata at any time?
Well, I'd rather, I mean, it's not like the Appassionata is going to be number one on my hit parade that I'm going to listen to it, you know, oh, God, I haven't heard that. But, you know, the thing about your life is you're only going to be able to, and this is the funny thing, this is Paul Bowles talked about this in his, in The Sheltering Sky, you know, that how many times you're going to be able to look at this. How many more times in your life are you going to hear the Appassionata, you know? So you sort of begin to look that way, you know, that sort of, or how many times you're going to do anything, you know, before you go. So, you know, and looking in that way, for me, it's there, it's part of my life, I love it, I don't want it to disappear, and there it is.
I mean, I agree with that sentiment with one caveat, which is that if it's not pleasurable for any reason,
Well, that
you
could be true of
then-
anything.
Right.
If it's not
Then you
pleasurable,
probably
don't
then
do
you
it.
probably don't want to repeat the experience.
Don't do it then.
But
yeah.
it depends. Obviously, that's a personal thing to every person. Going back to the 20th century part of the album, the living composer part of the album.
Oh, them.
Oh, them. I always wonder when commissioning a piece, and this is not the case in this. It is a wonderful piece that Jonathan Steiner wrote, but I often wonder how often a performer commissions a composer to write something, receives the piece, looks at it, and says, "Oh no, I'm going to have to play this."
Yeah, it's never happened to me.
You're
So I
lucky
don't
then,
know.
because I know a
Yeah.
lot of pianists that have received commissions and have said to themselves, "I can't play this," and not because it's not physically possible,
You know,
because
it isn't
it
me.
simply
it's not-
doesn't speak to them
Doesn't
in the
speak.
way they were hoping to. How do you let the composer down is the question.
Yeah, I wouldn't know because I've never had it. I've never happened. That's never happened. I was very happy with. Well, of course, Robert came to me with his piece, and I liked it immediately. You know, so.
Brahmsiana. Works of Brahms and those influenced by Brahms, also Robert Chumley and Jonathan Steiner. Great CD, Steve. It was a pleasure to work on it with
Joe.
you.
It was a pleasure to work on it with you.